Hey everyone. Tonight, we begin with one of history's most haunting love stories. This isn't just a fairy tale nor a legend. It's a true story about two extraordinary people whose minds were as powerful as their passion. Heloise, a gifted scholar ahead of her time, and her tutor, Abelard, a brilliant philosopher whose ideas shook the foundations of the medieval church. So, before you get too comfortable, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if this kind of content genuinely helps you wind down at night. And hey, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? There's something oddly soothing about knowing there are others awake with us, wandering through history together. Now, dim the lights, pull your blanket a little closer, and maybe let the soft hum of a fan play in the background. Let's ease into tonight's journey, slowly and gently. It's the year 1115. You're in Paris, but not the Paris you know from postcards and films. There is no Eiffel Tower, no boulangerie, no wide, tree-lined boulevards. This Paris is narrow, wet, and smoky. A cluster of stone and timber homes packed tight on the Ile de la Cité, where the river Seine curls like a cat sleeping around its feet. It's early morning, damp, chill, and loud in the way old cities always are. Carts rumble on cobblestones, dogs bark at shadows, and roosters never seem to care if you were sleeping. And yes, it smells of tanneries, latrines, horses, and a dozen kinds of open cooking fires. It smells like people. Too many of them. Too close. You're not a noble. You're a student. Or something like one. There's no such thing yet as a university, but that's what they'll call it someday. You study at the Cathedral School of Notre Dame. Yes, that Notre Dame. But not the one with flying buttresses and tourist lines. The cathedral's still under construction, actually. It won't look like the grand Gothic icon for another 100 years. Right now, it's more scaffolding than a sanctuary. And you're here for one reason. A man named Peter Abelard. You've heard his name whispered in the cloisters and scribbled in the margins of wax tablets. Abelard, brilliant, arrogant, loud. He debates like a knight jousts, and he leaves other teachers in ruins. Not everyone likes him, but everyone listens. If you're a student in Paris, you want to be near that kind of fire, even if it burns. The school isn't a school the way you'd imagine it. No blackboards, no bell schedule. Classes happen wherever there's space. A cloister walkway, a side room in a church, even outside in the gardens when the sun decides to show up. And forget desks. You write on your knees with wax and stylus. You copy what you can, but mostly, you listen, you memorize, you survive on scraps of learning, because books are precious, rare, sometimes chained to lecterns like sacred animals that might flee. Abelard teaches logic, philosophy, theology, when the bishops let him. He quotes Plato and Augustine in the same breath, and he does it all in Latin, fast Latin, showy Latin. You don't always keep up. But when he speaks, something stirs. He makes thinking feel like fire, and faith feel like a question waiting to be cracked open. Not everyone appreciates that. The other masters, the old and cautious ones, they're nervous and jealous. Abelard doesn't just teach. He argues, dismantles, and questions a lot of things. He's already been thrown out of at least one school for being too loud with his ideas. But he always comes back. Because students come for him. Because people want to hear what he says next, even if it makes them uncomfortable. That's where you are now. Sitting on a cold stone step, knees pulled to your chest, eyes half open from a sleepless night. It rained again. Your cloak is still wet. Your stomach rumbles, but you ignore it. Everyone's does. There's a hum in the courtyard. Abelard's coming. You hear him before you see him. The rhythm of his words, the sharpness of his laugh. Then, the cloak sweeping the ground, the eyes bright with ideas. He's already mid-sentence when he walks in, finishing an argument he started yesterday, or last week, or in a dream. It doesn't matter. He speaks like time bends for him. And you write, or try to. But the wax is damp, and your fingers are stiff. Still, you don't look away, because you want to understand. Because something in you believes that if you can just follow the thread of his thought, you'll get it. You'll unlock something ancient and hidden and true. This is your life now. You sleep on straw in a rented attic. You eat coarse bread, onions, and watered wine. You walk 5 miles a day through mud and sermon. You read by candlelight, or not at all. Your boots are falling apart. Your Latin is passable. Your future is uncertain. But your mind is awake in a way it has never been before. Abelard has that effect. He shakes people out of their old thoughts like dust from a blanket. Still, there are rumors that he doesn't know when to stop, that he's too sure of himself, that he's made enemies of powerful men. And lately, he's been spending time in the home of a canon named Fulbert. Fulbert has a niece, a young woman, educated, sharp-tongued. You've heard her name whispered in the same breath as his. She was named Heloise. You don't know much about her, not yet. Only that she's not like the others, that she's read more than most men, that she asks questions that make priests sweat, that she and Abelard have started something. But that's not your story, at least not yet. Before Abelard became a lover, or a name scrawled across centuries of Catholic scorn and scholarly admiration, he was a student, and then a destroyer of other students' masters. Peter Abelard was born in 1079 in the village of Le Palais near Nantes, in the Duchy of Brittany. His family was noble, but not excessively rich or powerful. What they did have, though, was education. His father had studied letters before taking up arms, and so, from an early age, Abelard was encouraged not toward battlefields, but toward books. He was not a passive reader. Even as a boy, he argued with ideas. He challenged assumptions. Where other children were taught to memorize, Abelard learned to question. This might sound ordinary to you now, in a world where curiosity is considered healthy. But in the medieval classroom, especially when that classroom was the church, questioning wasn't always welcome. By the time Abelard reached his early 20s, he had already begun what he called his war against the masters. He didn't mean it metaphorically. He literally traveled from school to school, teacher to teacher, not to learn from them, but to defeat them in debate. Think of it like a medieval academic version of chess boxing. Philosophical duels conducted in Latin before an audience of students, monks, and eager onlookers. His most famous intellectual opponent? William of Champeaux, a respected teacher in Paris, a man who taught realism, which in medieval terms meant believing in the existence of universals, that things like redness or beauty existed independently of individual objects. Abelard disagreed. He was a nominalist. He argued that universals were just names we gave to patterns, not real entities. It was radical, it was clever, and he won. Repeatedly. It's difficult to overstate how bold this was. You didn't just out-argue a master and walk away with a gold star. These debates shaped reputations, funding, positions, and access. When Abelard bested William, he didn't just score academic points. He humiliated one of the most prominent minds of the day. And he wasn't subtle about it. His writings dripped with self-assurance. He called himself Peter the Palatine, likening himself to Roman governors. His style was as sharp as his arguments. He believed he was right, and worse, he usually was. Naturally, this didn't win him many friends, but it did win him fame. By the early 1100s, Abelard was teaching at the Cathedral School of Notre Dame in Paris. That might not sound remarkable today, but in medieval France, it meant you were standing at the pinnacle of intellectual life. Paris was not yet the city of light, but it was becoming the heart of European scholarship. And Abelard was its brightest, most infuriating star. His lectures were electric. He had a way of untangling contradictions, exposing flaws in doctrine, and drawing the minds of young students into the dangerous habit of thinking for themselves. He taught theology, logic, and ethics. He asked, why? At a time when asking why was sometimes confused with heresy. And the students came in droves. Some walked hundreds of miles just to hear him speak. He was charismatic, magnetic, and openly proud of his abilities. That pride would be his downfall. But not yet. This was Abelard before Heloise. Before scandal and sorrow and surgical revenge. Before the letters that turned him from a scholar into a lover, and then into a relic of a love broken by the world. Back then, he was all mind, all argument, all fire. But even minds like his had limits. Even arrogance can hide fragility. His writings hint at isolation, a brilliant man among less brilliant company, a sense of being too far ahead and too self-aware to stop. He read Augustine, Plato, Aristotle. He admired them and then challenged them. He seemed unable to leave an idea untouched. Some called it genius, others pride. But pride, in medieval Europe, was more than a character flaw. It was a theological crime. He once wrote, "By long continued study, I had climbed to the summit of letters." That wasn't modesty. It was truth as he saw it. And for a while, the world agreed. But a mind like Abelard's doesn't stay out of trouble for long. By the time he met Heloise, he was already famous, not just for his intellect, but for his defiance. The church was watching him. The masters he had humiliated were waiting. And the more he taught, the more dangerous his ideas became. He wrote about contradictions in doctrine. He questioned authority, not from hatred, but from obsession with truth. And truth, as you'll see, is a complicated thing in a world run by power and prayer. And then, at the height of his influence, he accepted a tutoring position. Not unusual. A respected scholar might be asked to teach the children of noble or ecclesiastical households. In this case, the niece of a canon named Fulbert. A girl with more talent than most men around her. A student whose letters would one day rival and outshine his own. On the far side, before centuries of poetry and philosophy were written in her name, There was just Heloise, a young woman in Paris, brilliant, fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, at a time when most women couldn't read at all. She was not born into royalty or cloistered in a convent. She was not a noble heiress or a wandering mystic. She was, first and foremost, a scholar, one of the most gifted minds of her generation, and perhaps, quietly, one of the most overlooked. Heloise's early life is hard to trace. Like many women of the 12th century, her story begins in the margins of someone else's. She was likely born around 1100, somewhere in or near Paris. Her parents are not well recorded, but what we know is this. She was raised by her uncle, Fulbert, a man who held a position as a canon of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. That gave him influence, status, and connections within the powerful web of church and university. And with those connections, he ensured that Heloise was not only well educated, but unusually so. This was not a girl meant for a convent or a noble marriage. From an early age, she was shaped to think, argue, translate, and write. Her name had already begun to travel through scholarly circles. She wasn't just clever for a woman. She was clever. Period. Teachers respected her. Students gossiped about her, not for beauty or wealth, but for intellect. Heloise debated texts that many men feared to open. She could recite Cicero, untangle Aristotle, and quote Augustine with ease. But more than that, she understood them. She didn't just repeat knowledge, she wrestled with it, questioned it, lived inside it. This, more than anything, would later shape her letters. But intellect wasn't freedom. In medieval France, a woman's education, if allowed at all, was still tied to male permission. Heloise was brilliant, but also protected, guarded, owned in a way by Fulbert's reputation. The cathedral where he served was more than a church. It was a place of power, and power came with scrutiny. Even as Heloise pursued learning, she did so under Fulbert's roof, and his rules. That roof, heavy with expectations, would soon crack. At the time, Paris was becoming something new. It wasn't yet the grand capital it would later become, but it was a growing center of study and debate. The university didn't exist yet, not officially, but its bones were forming. Scholars gathered near Notre Dame. Latin echoed in halls and cloisters. The church ruled, but philosophy questioned. And into this world came Peter Abelard. He was older than Heloise, already famous, already controversial, a logician, theologian, and teacher whose name stirred admiration and irritation in equal measure. He had challenged his own masters, rewritten arguments, drawn crowds, but his fame was unstable, his enemies many. He was a man both respected and resented, and in Heloise, he would meet his match. But that part of the story comes later. For now, picture her simply. A young woman in a stone house near Notre Dame. The room smells faintly of wax and parchment. The light is low. Candles are expensive. On the table, a manuscript lies open, Latin glossed in careful ink. Heloise bends over the page. Her lips move slightly as she reads. Her eyes are steady. Her world is made of books, not ballads. She is not waiting for love. She is waiting for meaning. It is easy, centuries later, to romanticize her, to see only the lover, the abbess, the tragic figure under Abelard's shadow. But before the tragedy, there was brilliance. Before the romance, there was resistance. Heloise lived in a world that told women to be silent, she refused. And long before her words ever reached Abelard's hands, her thoughts had already taken flight. This is what makes her story extraordinary. Not just what she felt, but what she knew, and how she used it to shape everything that came next. By the early 12th century, Paris had begun to change. Not in the way cities rise with iron or machines, but with words. Ideas moved faster than stones, and the cathedral schools, especially the one at Notre Dame, were at the center of something quietly revolutionary. Theologians debated under vaulted ceilings. Students gathered in shadows, in cloisters, in cramped rooms that smelled of parchment, tallow, and damp wool. It was not yet a university, not in name, but the structure was forming. And among the voices rising above the Seine, none rang louder than that of Peter Abelard. Abelard was already famous before he ever crossed paths with her. He was known for his brilliance, his pride, and his endless need to question everything and everyone, especially his teachers. He challenged them in public, defeated them in disputations, and rewrote their lectures with sharper clarity. His mind worked like a blade, and he sharpened it daily on the flaws of others. Students flocked to him because he offered something rare, not just knowledge, but the power to question knowledge itself. His reputation grew until even Canon Fulbert, a churchman with influence in the cathedral school, took notice. Fulbert is Heloise's uncle. He had ambitions for her, though what kind, we cannot fully know. Perhaps he thought she would make a fine abbess one day. Perhaps he only wanted her brilliance to reflect back upon his own standing. Whatever the case, he invited Abelard to become her tutor. This was not unusual. Wealthy men often sought private instruction for their wards. What was unusual was how quickly the lessons stopped being just about philosophy. It began, as these things often do, with shared books. Abelard introduced her to classical texts, Cicero, Virgil, Boethius. She responded with questions that startled him. Her letters from that time no longer survive, but his do. And even in those, he admits, her mind was unlike any he had ever encountered. Their lessons stretched long into the evenings. They spoke not only of metaphysics, but of poetry, of language, of desire, veiled in allegory at first, then less and less so. The house they met in belonged to Fulbert, and yet it offered them more privacy than it should have. Abelard was clever. He wrote later that he persuaded the canon to let him move into the household under the pretense that this would allow him to better supervise Heloise's education. Fulbert agreed. Perhaps he admired Abelard too much. Perhaps he was naive. But he let the philosopher move in, not realizing that the tutor was already falling in love with the student. Or that the student, despite knowing better, had begun to feel the same. We must remember that love like this was dangerous. Women were not free to follow their own desires. The church had strict teachings. Scholars were expected to remain celibate, or at least discreet. And for someone as prominent as Abelard, this kind of affection, public, proud, undeniable, was ruinous. And yet they continued. Abelard would later write that love stole in with the ease of habit, that their kisses became more frequent than their lessons, that the pages of books became excuses to touch hands, to whisper what could not be spoken aloud. He was a man of logic, and she a woman of reason. But love does not respect intellect. It thrives in the gaps between it. Their affair was not equal, not always. Abelard had the authority. He had the fame. And yet, from what we read in their letters, it is Heloise who speaks with more certainty. She did not fall blindly. She knew the cost, perhaps more than he did. She warned him. She begged him to consider what they would lose. She understood, even then, that history rarely treats women kindly, but her heart, disciplined though it was, could not resist what had begun. And so the line between teacher and lover disappeared. They met by candlelight. They exchanged verses, wrote poems, some of which may still exist under anonymous names. The city outside did not sleep, but the world inside their little study narrowed to just two people and the words they shared. There is something quiet about the beginning of love, something that feels suspended. This was their pause before discovery, before scandal, before the weight of consequence came crashing down. For a brief time, it was only them. And though it would not last, it would change everything. Not only for Abelard and Heloise, but for the centuries of readers who would one day sit with their letters, trace the faded ink, and wonder what it meant to love someone more than your own safety, your own future, your own name. Because it all started with books. And sometimes, that's all it takes. There are homes built for warmth, safety, and family. And then, there are houses like the one owned by Canon Fulber, a place with thick stone walls that held in the cold and a silence that clung to the air like frost. It sat not far from the cathedral, in the heart of medieval Paris, close enough to the church to feel watched, and close enough to the schools to feel full of ambition. Canon Fulbert was a man of the cloth, but also a man of pride. His home was not a haven, but a stage. And into this stage stepped two people whose names would never quite leave each other's lives. Abelard proposed to live in Fulber's home and tutor his niece personally. Fulber agreed, and with that, he let the wolf into the fold. It's easy, centuries later, to imagine this as a tale of candles, whispers, and romantic defiance. But the truth was much less charming. The arrangement may have started with genuine intent. Abelard, the scholar, Heloise, the pupil. But it became something else almost immediately. They were both brilliant, both stubborn, both sure they were the exception to every rule. And their time together, under Fulbert's roof, blurred the line between instruction and infatuation. The home became a maze of stolen glances, coded phrases, and half-closed doors. Fulbert did not notice at first. He was too busy climbing small ladders in the church bureaucracy, too distracted by the prestige of hosting a celebrity teacher. And perhaps, like many men of authority in those days, he simply did not believe a young woman could make her own choices. But eventually, even the most careful secrets begin to leave cracks. The neighbors talked, servants whispered, and Heloise, bold, brilliant Heloise, was not always discreet. Later letters would show that their love, if it could be called that, was not gentle. It burned. It wrestled with guilt, with theology, with gender and power. Abelard once confessed that he punished Heloise for not focusing, that he hit her during lessons, that their encounters were laced with shame as well as desire. And yet Heloise, for all her intellect, seemed to accept it. She loved him not only as a man, but as a mind. She admired his thought more than his touch. Still, They both knew the rules of the world they lived in. And in that world, what they were doing wasn't only dangerous, it was unforgivable. When Fulber finally understood what had happened, whether from a confession, a letter, or a neighbor's cruel smile, his fury was not silent. He felt tricked, dishonored, not just as a guardian, but as a man whose house had been used. The betrayal in his eyes was not only about Heloise's virtue, it was about pride, about being made to look foolish in a city where reputation was everything. His home, once quiet, now echoed with anger. And Abelard, though clever in speech, had no defense that could calm the storm. The affair could no longer be hidden. Heloise was sent away, possibly to her aunt's house in Brittany, possibly to a convent for safety. Abelard tried to manage the fallout, but by then, Fulbert wanted something more than apology. He wanted justice, or revenge. Fulbert's house did not return to peace, and neither did the lives of those who once sat beneath its roof. What had begun as a lesson became a scandal, and the place that should have offered warmth instead became the spark that lit a tragedy. Abelard and Heloise would never be the same again, not in spirit, not in soul. And Fulbert, he would not forget, not for years, not until something much darker took root in his mind, because betrayal in medieval Paris was never just a matter of the heart. It was also a matter of blood. They met in quiet places, behind stone walls, beneath archways heavy with ivy, among the dry, whispering shelves of cathedral libraries. There were always people nearby, students, priests, servants. But somehow in those moments they were alone, not entirely hidden, but not exactly seen either. It wasn't rare for a tutor and his pupil to spend hours together, surrounded by scrolls and inkpots. But these meetings were never just about Latin conjugations or the finer points of Aristotle. There was always something else. A pause that lingered too long. A gaze that drifted from the parchment to the face across the table. A smile exchanged when no one else was looking. A hand that brushed another, just for a moment too long. The affair began quietly, like a candle catching at the edge of a page. Gentle, but growing. Books passed between them, not just textbooks, but poems, letters, pages scrawled in his hand, folded and slipped under a door, replies from her, neat and sharp, hidden within volumes of theology. They wrote in Latin, sometimes in code, sometimes in phrases too bold to be mistaken. He called her things no tutor should call a student. She answered with verses that were clever, subtle, but never cold. There was warmth in her words, curiosity, even playfulness. She was not passive in this game. She read, she replied, she challenged him. She was a scholar as much as a lover, and he, for all his cleverness, knew he'd met his equal. At first, they met only during lessons, then in the halls between them, then later, in corners and cloisters, under arches after vespers, or on narrow stone stairways where candlelight did not reach. The danger was part of it. She was a woman in a world of men, and he was a philosopher priest, bound not just by morals, but by vows, spoken or implied. But those boundaries began to blur. He was witty, proud, and adored by students. She was brilliant, bold, and unused to obedience. Together, they lit something the church would never approve. And soon, their affection turned to intimacy. Fulbert, her uncle, did not notice at first. He was a canon of the cathedral, a man of status and pride. He had trusted the tutor, welcomed him into their home, allowed him to teach her privately. even admired his intellect. But then came the whispers. A servant saw something, a shadow slipping into a room late at night, a voice behind a door that should have been closed. A neighbor heard laughter through the shutters. Too familiar, too soft. Someone else found a page of verse, unsigned but unmistakable. Fulbert, careful and proud, grew suspicious, and in that time, suspicion was dangerous. He began to watch, carefully, quietly, the way a cat watches birds. At meals, he studied their eyes. During lessons, he paused in the hall outside the door. He asked questions he already knew the answers to. He gave orders with unusual sharpness. The warmth of the household cooled. What had once felt like sanctuary began to feel like a trap. And yet, they did not stop. It's hard to say why. Perhaps they believed they were too clever to be caught. Perhaps they thought love made them immune. Or perhaps, like so many before and after them, they simply could not help it. The world outside their letters and stolen moments grew louder, but they clung to the quiet world they had built between the lines of poetry and prose. She wrote things that were not just romantic, but philosophical. She asked him questions that shook his confidence. She challenged his ideas, not just his affections. In her, he found not just beauty, but intellect that rivaled his own. He, in turn, opened doors to texts she had only dreamed of reading. He shared his thoughts, his works in progress, his doubts about the world and the church. There was love, yes, but there was also a meeting of minds that few around them could understand. They must have known it couldn't last. No secret survives forever, especially not one wrapped in parchment and perfume, hidden behind cathedral walls. But they kept meeting, kept writing, kept exchanging gifts. A ribbon, a relic, a verse. He may have believed he could control it. She may have believed it was worth the risk. But suspicion, once seated, does not sleep. Fulbert said nothing at first. That was his strength. He let the silence grow heavy. He let the lovers wonder. He let the walls feel like they were listening. And in that silence, the danger grew. Because in medieval Paris, love was not private. It was political. It was moral. It was watched. And for a respected philosopher and a young, unmarried woman, love was also a crime of arrogance, of betrayal, of theology. If discovered, it could ruin reputations, end careers, and shatter futures. And soon, it would. But for now, just for this chapter, they still had the letters. They still had the books. They still had the narrow stairwells and quiet libraries. The world was narrowing around them, but the words between them still burned. And Fulbert was still watching. There had always been rumors, whispers in the cloisters, quiet snickers among students. But rumors were easy to dismiss. A talented tutor and his gifted pupil. Surely that explained the closeness. A young woman's keen intellect, a man's animated lectures, nothing more than the admiration of minds. That's what people told themselves, at least, until it became impossible to pretend otherwise. Abelard was brilliant, confident, and admired, but he was also proud to a fault. And pride, especially in the medieval world, could be dangerous. He had once described himself as the only philosopher in France worth listening to. He mocked his rivals. He challenged even the most respected scholars with biting wit. And when it came to his affair with Heloise, that pride did not disappear. In fact, it grew. He began to boast. Not in the streets, not in front of crowds, but in private corners, to trusted friends, or to those he wanted to impress. Small comments, veiled suggestions, even a wink here and there, and those who heard him listened closely. Because everyone wanted a glimpse into the life of a man like Abelard. And when that glimpse revealed a secret love affair with a young, noble woman under the roof of her churchman uncle, the gossip spread like fire. Heloise, on the other hand, denied it. Not because it wasn't true, but because she understood the cost. She was careful, measured, always aware of how fragile her position was. A woman in a world of male power, a scholar in a world that didn't expect her to think. And now, entangled in something that could ruin not only her own future, but that of the man she admired most. When the rumors reached her, she was calm, dismissive, even bold in her denials. She would not let the world reduce their connection to something vulgar or foolish. It had been more than lust, more than sin. It had been, still was, something rare, something worth protecting. But the whispers grew louder, and it wasn't just Fulber now. Word of the affair began to reach the chapter house, the schools, even the episcopal offices. It was not merely that a man of learning had betrayed his vow of chastity. It was that he had done so while under the protection of the church. And worse still, he had done it with a woman entrusted to his care. A student, yes, but also a niece of a canon. A woman whose reputation in that time and place was all she had. Her name and virtue were the same thing, and now both were stained. Fulbert, humiliated, felt betrayed not only by Abelard, but also by the church itself. He had invited the man in, opened his home, allowed the lessons, the books, the letters, and now his niece was the subject of public shame. He began to act, not just as a wounded uncle, but as a man whose honor had been publicly dragged through the mud. He spoke to other clergy. He demanded answers. And when none came quickly enough, he made sure the affair was no longer a whisper, but a declaration. The scandal took on a life of its own. Abelard was summoned to explain himself, not in a courtroom, but in halls of power where church and reputation mattered more than personal guilt. His enemies, scholars he had mocked, canons he had embarrassed, used the moment to strike. They reminded others of his arrogance, his lack of humility, his dangerous ideas. This was not just about a love affair anymore. It was about pride. It was about order. It was about punishing a man who had challenged too much for too long. Abelard, for his part, did not grovel. He never did. He acknowledged the affair, yes, but with the kind of poetic, philosophical detachment that frustrated his accusers even more. He spoke of love, of learning, of human weakness and divine grace. He framed their relationship not as scandalous, but as something noble, even educational. He did not see her as a victim. He described her as his equal. And in doing so, he further enraged a church that wanted remorse, not rhetoric. Heloise stayed silent, at least in public. But her silence was not submission. In private letters, she expressed pain, not just at the betrayal of trust, but at the way the world tried to define her. She had not been seduced. She had chosen. She had loved. And now, she was being painted as a foolish girl, a passive figure in a drama she had helped write. It must have burned, but she bore it with a kind of strength that would define her later life. She would not apologize for having loved. What shocked the church even more was her refusal to accept the role Abelard wanted for her next. He proposed marriage, in secret, to preserve her honor, to erase the scandal, to quiet Fulbert, but she refused, at least at first. She had never wanted to be a wife. She had wanted to be a scholar, a philosopher, a thinker. And in that world, marriage was not just a change in name. It was the end of identity. A wife belonged to her husband. She bore children. She kept house. She vanished from the world of letters. And Heloise had no desire to vanish. Still, pressure mounted. From Abelard, from Fulbert, from the scandal that would not die. Eventually, she agreed. They would marry in secret. No feast, no witnesses, just a quiet ceremony, and a vow that would satisfy no one completely. Fulbert wanted justice. The church wanted repentance. And the world wanted a punishment that matched the offense. But there was no real justice coming. Only more secrecy, more guilt, and soon, far worse consequences. The affair that had begun in whispers had become something louder, something historical, a scandal that pulled in the most powerful institution in the land. It wasn't just about a man and a woman anymore. It was about the boundaries of love and law, of philosophy and faith. And the church, vast and eternal, had turned its gaze fully on them now. They had once moved through shadows, in corners, in silence. But now, they were center stage, and the curtain had just gone up. By the time the church caught wind of their secret, the damage had already been done, at least by the standards of medieval honor. Before their marriage, before the scandal had fully ripened, Heloise became pregnant. And not just with gossip, or shame, or the heavy burden of secrecy, but with a child. A child who would not be raised in quiet domesticity, or with the blessing of family. A child born from a union that was supposed to be intellectual, scholarly, spiritual. At least, that's how it was meant to appear to the outside world. The details are sparse, but the essentials are known. When Heloise realized she was with child, Abelard did not hesitate. He arranged for her to leave Paris and travel secretly to Brittany, where his own family lived. It was a practical decision, not just a protective one. Heloise's presence in Fulbert's house had become a lightning rod, and her swelling belly would have made any denial impossible. In Brittany, she could deliver quietly, away from curious eyes, away from the church, and perhaps, most importantly, away from the wrath that was already brewing back in Paris. There, in the countryside, among strangers and far from the libraries and lecture halls that had defined her life, Heloise gave birth to a son. They named him Astrolabe, a name as strange then as it is now. But for Abelard, it meant something. The astrolabe was an instrument used to map the stars, to measure the heavens, a symbol of knowledge, precision, and the movement of celestial bodies. Naming a child that it was no ordinary act. It was a declaration. This was not just a child born of desire. This was a child born of reason and reflection. A child meant to live in the light of knowledge. Still, a name could not protect him, and it certainly could not shield his parents from what came next. After his birth, Heloise returned to Paris, at Abelard's request, not to resume her place at Fulbert's table, but to enter a convent. Not yet as a nun, but as a guest, as a woman hidden from the world, while Abelard tried to make things right. or more accurately, while he tried to salvage his reputation. Their secret marriage was carried out in haste. It was meant to satisfy Fulbert, to protect Heloise's name. But it did neither. Fulbert continued to seethe, and the church, now fully aware of the affair, offered no absolution. Meanwhile, Astrolabe remained in Brittany, likely raised by Abelard's sister, Denise. There is no evidence of Heloise ever seeing him again. No tender reunions. No letters exchanged between mother and child. In fact, Heloise would later write that she had never wanted the child, not because she lacked love, but because she had never wanted to be a mother. She had wanted a life of the mind, not the cradle. She viewed motherhood as a chain, not a crown. In one of her letters, she even said, "God knows I would rather be called your whore than your wife." Not out of shame, but out of defiance toward a world that forced women to choose between love and learning. As for Abelard, he seemed to carry the boy more as a symbol than as a son. In his later writings, Astrolabe appears only in passing, and always with the tone of philosophical reflection, never personal warmth. Abelard was a man of logic, of ideas. He could speak passionately about theology, sin, grace, but when it came to his own child, he remained distant, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of necessity, or perhaps he truly believed that the best thing he could offer his son was a name that meant something, rather than a father who could not be present. Astrolabe did not vanish into history entirely. Years later, records suggest that he entered the church, possibly as a canon at Nantes, though scholars debate the details. A man named Astrolabe does appear in ecclesiastical records from the 1140s and 1150s, and though it's impossible to prove with absolute certainty, the timeline and name make it likely. If it was the same Astrolabe, he would have followed in his father's footsteps, not in scandal, but in service to the church. An odd twist of fate, given how his very existence had begun in violation of its rules. There's no indication that he rose to great prominence. No treatises, no theological debates, no lasting legacy in the intellectual world. But that, in itself, is telling. In a time when birth could define destiny, Astrolabe lived quietly. He did not become a second Abelard. He did not try to outshine the scandal that bore him. Perhaps he wanted peace, or perhaps he simply understood that history had already made its choice about what kind of story he belonged to. One where he was always a shadow, never a central figure. What's most striking is that neither Heloise nor Abelard ever wrote to him, at least not in letters that survived. They wrote to each other, long, passionate, aching letters filled with memory and meaning. But their son remains outside those pages. He is never the center, always the footnote. It's not hard to imagine the sadness in that, or the sense of distance that would have grown with time. Still, Astrolabe's life, though largely unknown, is a thread that runs through the rest of the story. A silent presence, proof that love, even forbidden, leaves echoes. That choices made in passion can create lives that must be lived out in ordinary time. He was a child born of brilliance and rebellion, raised in obscurity, named for the stars, and left to walk a path shaped by two of the most controversial lovers in medieval Europe. His parents would go on to lead very different lives. She became an abbess. He became a monk. They both became legends. But Astrolabe? He lived in the margins. A real person with real duties, perhaps with doubts of his own. But history, like parents, doesn't always know what to do with children born in the middle of scandal. He did not change the world, but he existed. And sometimes, in stories like this, that's more than enough. In the tangled web of love and scandal that defined Abelard and Heloise's story, the secret marriage stands as a pivotal moment, one meant to bring resolution, yet instead only deepened the tragedy. It was an attempt to restore honor, a desperate act to calm the storm of fury swelling around them. But in the end, it solved nothing. For Heloise, the marriage was a cage, not a sanctuary. For Fulbert, it was a wound that demanded more than quiet acceptance. And for the church, it was a scandal that could not be ignored. The circumstances that led to the secret marriage were complicated, but the pressures were clear. After Heloise's pregnancy was revealed, and the birth of their son Astrolabe, Fulbert's rage was no longer contained. The reputation of his niece, and by extension his own honor, had been publicly sullied by the affair. In medieval society, where family name and social standing were everything, such a breach was dangerous, not just socially, but politically. Fulbert, a man who wielded considerable influence as the canon of Notre Dame, felt betrayed. His anger was not merely paternal, but also a calculated desire for revenge. Abelard, despite his arrogance and reputation as a brilliant scholar, was no match for Fulbert's wrath. He knew that admitting to the affair, and more importantly, to the child, could ruin him and destroy Heloise's fragile future. Yet, he also knew that silence was impossible. Something had to be done to appease Fulbert and the church alike. The solution, as it often was in medieval times, was marriage, a sacred contract that could, at least on paper, legitimize the relationship, shield Heloise's honor, and placate Fulbert's fury. But the marriage was secret, no grand ceremony, no public celebration. It was whispered in cloisters, exchanged under vows taken in private. Historians believe it took place in the early 1110s, shortly after the birth of Astrolabe. The secrecy was necessary. Marriage without the church's blessing, especially in such a scandalous context, was risky. Both Abelard and Heloise knew the consequences if their union became widely known. It would not just affect their lives, but could lead to excommunication or worse. For Abelard, the marriage was a pragmatic act. He was a man of reason, of logic and debate, not romance. His focus was on his intellectual work and his position as a teacher. Marriage, especially one that bound him to Heloise, who was fiercely independent and intellectually gifted, was a potential distraction. He likely hoped it would be a formality, a necessary concession to social pressures, nothing more. For Heloise, the marriage was far more complicated. Unlike Abelard, she never wanted to be a wife. Her ambitions were rooted in scholarship, theology, and independence. She had come to Paris to study, to learn, and to teach. She was fiercely proud of her mind and resented the roles prescribed to women in medieval society. Being married meant submission, obedience, and the loss of autonomy. In her letters to Abelard, she expressed a deep reluctance and sorrow over the union. She famously wrote, "I would rather be your whore than your wife," emphasizing that marriage, in her eyes, was a social chain rather than a romantic bond. Heloise's feelings were not unusual for the time. Medieval marriage, especially for women of intellect or ambition, was often a means of control rather than partnership. The church preached submission and obedience from wives to husbands. Education for women was rare, and a married woman was expected to prioritize household and family over personal pursuits. Heloise's struggle was the collision between her personal desires and the harsh realities of medieval womanhood. Fulbert, meanwhile, remained unconvinced by the marriage. He had hoped that by forcing Abelard's hand, the scholar would be trapped into a conventional life, bound by duty and obligation. But Abelard's secret marriage only fueled his desire for revenge. In Fulbert's eyes, Abelard had defiled his family's honor and then tried to hide behind the cloak of matrimony. The secret nature of the marriage made the insult even sharper. It was a public slight, a private humiliation. The streets of Paris had fallen silent under the thick, cold blanket of night. Torches sputtered in the occasional breeze, casting flickering shadows against the ancient stone walls. But for the most part, the city slept. A restless quiet settled over the winding alleys and narrow lanes, broken only by the distant bark of a dog or the faint rustling of rats in the gutters. Inside a modest home near the university district, Pierre Abelard lay in bed, unaware that this night would mark the turning point in his life. A night soaked in rage, betrayal, and cruel vengeance. The scholar who had once been the brightest star of Parisian intellect was about to be undone, not by debate or discourse, but by the cold edge of a blade. Abelard's sleep was shallow. The weight of his scandal, the precariousness of his secret marriage, and the fear of Fulbert's wrath gnawed at him. But exhaustion finally pulled him under. His breathing evened, the rhythmic sound filling the small chamber, while outside, unseen eyes watched, waited. Fulbert, the uncle whose anger had festered like a wound, had made his decision long ago. His niece's honor had been stolen, and no punishment seemed fitting except the most extreme. An act so brutal, it would scar Abelard not just in body, but forever in soul. For Fulbert, words were no longer enough. Blood was the currency now. Under the cover of darkness, Fulbert's hired men slipped through the city's quiet streets like shadows. These were no common thieves or bandits, but men chosen for their ruthless efficiency and lack of mercy. Knives gleamed cold in their hands, short, sharp, made for precision and pain. They approached Abelard's home, every step deliberate, every breath held. Locks were picked, or doors quietly forced, and soon they stood inside the scholar's chambers. The air was still and heavy, the faint scent of candle wax mingling with the musty odor of old parchment and ink. Abelard lay vulnerable, a scholar who had wrestled with God and man alike, now caught defenseless in the grip of violence. A sudden movement, shadows flickering at the edge of his vision, jerked him awake. The room erupted into chaos. Abelard scrambled for his belongings, perhaps reaching for a dagger he kept nearby, but the assailants were faster. They descended on him like a storm. The fight was desperate. Abelard's voice rose in shouts and pleas, but the attackers were relentless, their blades flashing like lightning. The sound of steel cutting through fabric and flesh filled the chamber. Abelard grappled with one man, then another, each struggle a frantic dance of survival. But the odds were cruelly against him. The final moment came suddenly and without mercy. One blade struck with calculated cruelty, aimed low, precise, savage. Abelard's world tilted. Pain exploded like wildfire as the men severed his manhood in a cold, surgical strike. The shock was immediate and overwhelming. Abelard collapsed, pain racking his body, his breath catching in ragged gasps. The men, their grim task complete, vanished as swiftly as they had arrived, swallowed once more by the shadows of the night. The room was left silent, but for the ragged breaths of a man undone. The mutilation was not merely an act of physical violence. It was a calculated message, a brutal form of justice in Fulbert's eyes. Abelard had taken Heloise's virginity, shattering the sanctity of her honor. Now his own manhood was taken in return, a grotesque balance in a world ruled by harsh codes and unforgiving traditions. For Abelard, the blow was more than a wound. It was a rupture that cleaved his identity, his pride, and his future. The scholar who had once commanded classrooms and challenged the church was now marked, broken in a way that few could endure. Pain and humiliation coiled tightly within him. The night's violence left scars that would never heal. Yet even in the darkest moments, Abelard's mind fought to grasp meaning beyond the blood and agony, though the path ahead was forever altered. By dawn, the city stirred, unaware of the brutal crime that had unfolded behind closed doors. Abelard lay broken but alive, caught in a moment where violence and vengeance had rewritten his story, a night that would echo through history, not just for its cruelty, but for the shattered lives it left behind. The streets of Argenteuil were quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against the ears and stirs the heart with unease. On a gray morning that felt more like morning than dawn, Heloise stepped through the gates of the Abbey of Saint. Mary, her cloak wrapped tightly around her, as if it could shield her from the world collapsing around her. The iron hinges groaned as the doors shut behind her, not loudly, not rudely, but with a finality that left no doubt. She was inside. The outside world, with its libraries and letters, debates and dreams, was now behind her. She had not come here freely. Just weeks earlier, she had been walking beneath the high stone arches of Paris with books tucked under her arm, ink still on her fingertips, her mind alight with philosophy and poetry. Though the scandal of her love for Abelard had begun to spread in whispers, she still clung to the idea that knowledge, reason, and love would win, that two brilliant minds in love could outthink the fury of the world. But that was before the night the knives came out, before her uncle, Fulbert, turned from fury to vengeance, before her beloved Abelard was left mutilated and broken by a group of hired men, and their lives were shattered into silence and retreat. The moment the attack became known, everything changed for Heloise. Her name was now whispered not in admiration, but in judgment. No longer was she the gifted student whose letters rivaled her teacher's wit. Now, she was the woman at the center of scandal, the niece who had shamed her family, the lover whose passion had brought disgrace. Fulbert, who once basked in the glow of his niece's intellect, now sought to erase the entire affair from memory, and the church, ever watchful and swift in its condemnation, turned its eyes on the girl who had dared to love too boldly. There was only one way to silence the storm. She must disappear. At first, they spoke of it gently. A retreat, they said. A quiet place where she might recover from the ordeal, reflect, and wait for the world to forget. Abelard himself, racked with guilt, urged her to go. It was for her protection, he said, a way to preserve her safety, her reputation. But Heloise had always seen deeper than the surface of words. This wasn't protection. This was exile. Still, she agreed. Not because she accepted it, but because she understood the truth. She had no choice. A woman without a protector in this world, especially one branded by scandal, was vulnerable to far worse than silence. So, she let them take her to Argenteuil, to the convent she had once visited in childhood. But she did not enter as a nun, not at first. She arrived as a lay guest, occupying a quiet corner of the abbey, wearing no veil, holding no vows. The other sisters kept a respectful distance, unsure how to receive a girl so young and so full of worldly learning. Her reputation preceded her. Some were in awe, others were wary, and Heloise, ever the scholar, tried to cling to her books. She wrote when she could, read when allowed, but there were fewer books here. No long nights of philosophical disputation, no heated debates about universals and particulars, no laughter that sparked from the friction of two bright minds in love, just long prayers, long silences, and the sound of footsteps echoing down stone halls. She did not belong here. She knew it, and she said so, loudly at times. "I am not called to this," she insisted more than once to the abbess. "I have not heard the voice of God. I have heard only the voices of men telling me what I must become." But voices of men held power, more than she wished. News from the outside world arrived in quiet waves. The scandal had not faded. The whispers had not stopped. If anything, they grew louder, more dangerous. The church was watching. Her uncle's allies pressed the matter further, and Abelard, now isolated, ashamed, and broken, no longer argued with the tide. He encouraged it. If she took the veil, the scandal would die. If she bound herself to a cloister, the shame would be sealed behind monastery walls. And so, it was decided. A day was set. The ceremony would be modest, but official. She would put on the veil. She would kneel before the altar. She would become, at least in name, what she had never asked to be. The night before the ceremony, Heloise sat alone beneath a tree in the convent garden. The sky above was blanketed with stars, but she could barely bring herself to look up. She felt hollowed out, like something inside her had been quietly carved away. She whispered into the silence, not a prayer, but a question. Is this obedience, or is this betrayal? She did not know. The next morning, she walked slowly to the chapel, her steps weighted with sorrow. She wore white, as tradition demanded, though it felt more like a shroud than a garment of joy. As the abbess prayed, Heloise barely heard the words. She knelt, repeated what was required, and when the veil was lowered onto her head, she did not weep, but neither did she smile. It was done. She was now Sister Heloise. But inside, she remained the woman who had once quoted Ovid by candlelight, who had once challenged her teacher in theology and in love, who had once believed that a mind like hers could walk beside any man. Now, she walked among stone and silence. The veil rested on her head, but it did not rest easy. And though the world believed the scandal had been contained, buried beneath habits and psalms, Heloise knew the truth. Her heart had not been tamed. Her mind had not surrendered. She had entered the convent, yes, but not her soul. Not yet. The door closed behind him with a dull thud, heavy and wooden and damp with the breath of winter. Inside the stone guest chamber, Abelard stood motionless for a moment, cloak dripping from rain, chest still rising and falling from the exertion of travel. His eyes darted around, not in fear exactly, but with the fractured caution of a man who once belonged everywhere and now trusts nothing. The fire in the corner gave little warmth, and the silence of the room wrapped around him like a judgment. He had not come here to pray. He had come here to disappear. News of what had happened to him had spread like fire through parchment halls and city streets. Abelard, once the pride of Paris, the great philosopher who had bent logic to his will, had been undone. Not in debate, not in theology, but by force and vengeance. He had been silenced not by argument, but by a knife, or several. And now, even the people who once hung on his every word spoke his name with something like pity. He had fled, but not without shame dragging behind him like a second cloak. The monastery, remote, silent, disciplined, had offered a kind of refuge. Not comfort, never that. There was no comfort left for him in the world. But it offered a gate, a wall, and a place where questions didn't always demand answers, where vows were whispered, not shouted, where his face could remain hidden beneath a hood. And yet, no gate could contain his mind. Even here, among the monks, many of whom revered him in secret or avoided him in fear, Abelard's thoughts refused to rest. While his body lay wounded and his name dragged through gossip like mud in a street, his intellect still burned with the same unruly flame. He debated aloud in empty rooms. He rewrote arguments in his head while lying sleepless beneath woolen blankets. He still composed verses, but now they stung with loss, with humiliation, with theology twisted by sorrow. God had always been part of his thought, but now God became his sparring partner, not the tender deity of liturgy and incense, but the cold mind that allowed fate to crush a man for loving too deeply and speaking too boldly. He wrestled with heaven, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. Sometimes, late at night, he paced the cloister with ink-stained hands, muttering phrases under his breath, reconstructing sentences, challenging premises. The other monks, especially the younger ones, whispered about him. Some feared his brilliance, others idolized it. A few dared to approach him, seeking answers to questions about logic or scripture. He gave them answers, but often more than they asked for, and never what they expected. He was less a teacher now than a storm. There were rules in this place. Silence, submission, obedience. Abelard followed them with the appearance of compliance, but not in spirit. His presence here was not conversion. It was containment. The world outside had grown too sharp, his enemies too numerous. Fulbert's act had changed not just his body, but the very shape of his life. He could not return to Paris. Not now. The lecture halls would murmur. The students would stare, and every victory would feel like a reminder of what had been lost. And Heloise. He could not write to her. Not yet. He imagined her often. Her voice, her arguments, the way she tilted her head when challenging his claims. He saw her walking the cloister of Argenteuil, veiled now, surrounded by nuns instead of scholars. She had entered that world because he had asked her to, because he believed it would protect her. And now he was here, behind his own walls. But neither of them had been saved. They had only been separated. He knew what people were saying, that his pride had been his downfall, that he had flown too close to the sun of church authority, that he had seduced brilliance for his own gain, that his punishment was divine. He heard all of it, and yet he wrote. He wrote with fury, with elegance, with the same exacting logic that had once dismantled entire schools of thought. He wrote to prove that he was still capable, that his mind had not been cut down with the rest of him. He poured himself into treatises, into commentaries, into letters never sent. He wrote as if the very act of putting ink to parchment could rebuild the man who had been broken. But every word carried weight now. There was no laughter in his margins, no casual wit in his footnotes. The brightness of his youth had dulled into something harder, colder. His prose still dazzled, but it no longer danced. Even when writing of God, he seemed to be interrogating rather than worshiping. And behind it all, beneath the philosophy, the structure, the reason, there was pain. A pain that came not only from what had been done to him, but from knowing it had changed everything. His legacy, once assured, now lay on uncertain ground. Would he be remembered for his brilliance, or for his scandal? Would the name Abelard echo in university halls, or be buried beneath the shame of one night's violence? He did not know, and so he wrote more. Some monks avoided him entirely. Others copied his pages, eager to preserve his work, even as they pretended not to understand it. A few sought his friendship, but he held them at arm's length. He had given too much trust in the past, and the cost had been carved into him forever. Each day, he rose with the bell, moved through the rituals, spoke the prayers, but his mind was never still. His thoughts were elsewhere, always circling, always arguing, always asking the questions that others were afraid to voice. In the stillness of the cloister, Abelard's body rested, but his soul paced endlessly, because he had not come here to find peace. He had come to survive. The years passed slowly, marked not by seasons or sermons, but by the echo of unspoken words. Silence was now the language they lived in. And yet, silence could not bury everything, not when ink could bleed through the years and reopen every wound. It was not immediate, this correspondence. Time had done its work on both of them. Abelard, broken but brilliant, buried behind monastery walls, wrote as if his soul were trapped in parchment. Heloise, now veiled and cloistered, received his letters like thunder in a room built for whispers. When the first of them reached her, it wasn't love that rose up to greet the words. It was rage. He had written of his misfortune, of his suffering, of his humiliation, but not once, not even in passing, did he mention her suffering. Her name was present, yes, but more like a character in his personal tragedy than a partner in their shared undoing. Heloise read the letter with the eyes of someone who had loved too deeply, followed too far, and been forgotten too quickly. She responded, not delicately, not kindly. Her words came like knives of her own, not to wound, but to make him feel, to make him remember that while he had bled, she had been forced to live on with the ghost of a future he had promised and then taken away. Her first letter was not a love letter. It was a reckoning. She told him what it had cost her, being forced into the convent, not by her own calling, but by his solution. You sought to protect my reputation, she wrote, but you never asked what I truly wanted. She had been a scholar, not a saint, a philosopher, not a bride. She had followed Abelard into sin, and then been abandoned in sanctity. And worse, he had asked her to hide her love behind a veil. But the strange thing was, she still loved him. She said so, plainly, painfully. You are ever present in my thoughts, she wrote, and I find no solace in prayer that does not also include the memory of you. Her words betrayed her resentment, but also her longing. This was no naive devotion. It was clear-eyed, brutal, and complete. Even in the cloister, her heart remained unconfined. Did she forgive him? Not entirely. Not right away. Perhaps not ever in full. But she understood him. That was her greatest strength, and possibly her greatest curse. She understood why he had acted as he did, why he had tried to bind her to a convent rather than a scandal, why he had pulled away from her emotionally, even while writing letters filled with theological grandeur. She recognized the conflict within him between love and logic, guilt and glory. Abelard, for his part, was not deaf to her accusations. He replied, sometimes defensively, sometimes with sorrow, often with a tone that seemed to rise above emotion into abstraction. He spoke of sin, of divine justice, of how his punishment had aligned him more closely with God. He wrote of providence, not passion. But Heloise wasn't interested in divine explanations. She wanted the truth, the human one. Over time, their letters revealed something deeper than apology or absolution. They revealed two people trying to make sense of a catastrophe they had both survived, but not in the same way. He wanted to forget. She wanted to remember. He turned toward God. She turned toward him. I would rather be your whore than a queen in any palace, she wrote in one of her most famous replies. It wasn't a cry for pity. It was a challenge. She had embraced their love, with all its consequences, but she refused to rewrite it into a holy metaphor. She demanded that he see what they had as it was, raw, beautiful, devastating. Abelard continued to drift toward philosophy, toward theology, toward the cold clarity of structured thought. He wrote about the Trinity, about original sin, about ethics, and through it all, Heloise kept pressing him. What of us? What of me? Are we only to live now in theory? And still, she signed every letter in Eterna Memoria, in eternal memory. That phrase said what the rest of the letter sometimes could not. Because underneath every argument, every subtle turn of phrase, every quote from Scripture or Plato, was the unbearable weight of a love that had been taken before it could finish becoming what it was meant to be. Did Heloise forgive him? Perhaps not in the way stories want her to. She did not fade into sainthood, did not bless his decisions with retrospective approval, but she remained faithful to the memory of their love, even as she built a life beyond it. She rose to lead the Abbey of the Paraclete, becoming a mother to dozens of women, guiding them with the same fire and intellect that once challenged Abelard in Paris. She never remarried. She never wrote another man with such intensity. She never allowed herself to become merely the tragic figure of someone else's downfall. And she preserved his letters, not for vengeance, not even for legacy, but because she knew what they meant, not just to them, but to anyone who had ever loved and lost in a world that demanded repentance instead of understanding. In the end, perhaps forgiveness wasn't the point. Perhaps the letters were never meant to resolve their pain, but to bear witness to it. To testify that love, real love, fierce and flawed and full of conflict, doesn't always end in reconciliation. Sometimes it ends in ink, in parchment, in lines scratched by candlelight under the eyes of a woman who still remembered the sound of his voice when he taught her Greek. Their love never returned to what it was, but it refused to die. And centuries later, those letters still speak, confessing, grieving, loving, far beyond the walls of any convent or cloister. Because in the end, the most human thing they did was not fall in love. It was surviving it. By the time Abelard retreated fully into his studies, the physical pain had dulled, but the humiliation remained raw. What Fulbert's men had taken from him wasn't just flesh. It was dignity, agency, the public image of the man who had once bested every master at Notre Dame. He had been the golden boy of reason. Now, he was a cautionary tale. But Abelard did not break. He turned inward and then upward. From behind monastery walls, he began to write not simply with defiance, but with intent. If he could not argue from the pulpit, he would argue from the page. And he did, page after page, letter after letter, book after book. He questioned assumptions others dared not name aloud. He framed suffering not as a punishment, but as a teacher, and he would not let theology become merely the echo of tradition. He wanted it to bleed, to wrestle, to mean something. It was during these years that his ideas sharpened into something both dangerous and dazzling. He tackled one of the Church's oldest questions. If God is good, why do the innocent suffer? Most men answered with silence or quoted Augustine. Abelard wrote an entire treatise. In sic et non, yes and no, he presented contradictory statements from the Church Fathers, side by side, without resolving them, not to discredit them, but to teach others how to think, how to question, how to search. He refused to hand down theology like a fixed recipe. For Abelard, even faith had to pass through the fire of logic. This was no small rebellion. He revisited the story of the fall and dared to ask, was sin inherited, or was it chosen? Did guilt transfer with blood, or did it bloom only in the heart? Unlike Augustine, who saw original sin as a birthright of failure, Abelard saw morality as an act of will. He argued that sin required intention, consent, that even Adam's descendants were not born guilty, only born capable of guilt. It was a nuanced distinction, but a radical one. It threatened to shift centuries of doctrine. The Church took notice. Bernard of Clairvaux, the sainted Cistercian, called Abelard's ideas dangerous, clever heresy wrapped in scholarly robes. Bernard spoke of Abelard the way one might speak of a poisoned chalice. Beautiful, but lethal. He accused him of pride, of arrogance, of undermining divine mystery with human logic. And yet, the Church could not unhear what had been written, because Abelard's pain had given his theology weight. This was not the detached theorizing of an academic untouched by suffering. He had suffered, publicly, brutally, and instead of growing bitter, he had turned that pain into a lens through which he could reimagine redemption. He knew what it meant to be punished beyond proportion, to be shamed, to be abandoned. And so, when he wrote of Christ's crucifixion, not merely as payment for sin, but as the ultimate act of love, his words rang truer than those who had only ever echoed others. God, Abelard argued, does not demand satisfaction like a medieval lord demanding a debt. God offers love, and love transforms. He was not dismissing sin. He was reframing the divine response to it. To those who read him, the effect was unsettling, compelling. Some were drawn to it like moths to flame. Others wanted to extinguish it outright. But no one ignored it. And Heloise? She read every word. Though hidden behind convent walls, she remained tethered to Abelard's mind through ink. She received his writings, his treatises, his letters, his defenses. She read them not as a student now, but as someone who had seen the man inside the philosophy. She didn't always agree with him. She still questioned his motives, still wrestled with the contradictions between the man who had once written love poems in her margins and the one who now wrote treatises on divine grace. But she read on, because what he was doing mattered. In one letter, she responded with a request that seemed almost mundane, that he compose a set of rules, a guide for the nuns under her care. But in that request was something deeper. It was her way of saying, your mind still belongs to us, to the women you taught, to the life we once began together. And Abelard did write them, the rule for nuns, tailored specifically for the Abbey of the Paraclete. His theology was not abstract to her. It was living. It was lived. He spoke of love and forgiveness not because they were poetic, but because he had seen how little of either the world truly offered. And Heloise, even if she bristled at his detachment, never stopped being moved by his brilliance. She would lead her community with wisdom that had once been sharpened in the furnace of his teachings. And she would carry, perhaps silently, the ache of what might have been. Their relationship had long since passed out of the realm of earthly romance, but the bond remained, not as fire, perhaps, but as coals beneath a bed of ash, warm, smoldering, eternal. Abelard would continue to write, even as criticism mounted. His voice, once cheered in lecture halls, now drew suspicion in councils. He was condemned at sins, silenced for a time. But his ideas on suffering, on guilt, on intention, spread, copied, taught. Even those who disagreed with him often found themselves using his language, his logic, because he had changed the questions. And in doing so, he had changed theology itself. Pain had not made Abelard bitter. It had made him dangerous. Dangerous not because he defied the church, but because he forced it to think, to wrestle, to justify. He never claimed to be a martyr. He was simply a man who had lived through agony and refused to let it end him. And Heloise? She kept reading. Then Heloise became abbess of a convent Abelard had founded. She led dozens of women, educated them, empowered them, even as she mourned. The abbey sat in the soft folds of the French countryside, a cluster of stone buildings ringed by quiet fields and whispering trees. It was not majestic like the cathedrals of Chartres or Reims. It did not gleam with gold or echo with the grandeur of princes, but it breathed, it endured. It held the weight of a life rebuilt. This was the Paraclete, named for the Holy Spirit, the Comforter, and it would become Heloise's world. The abbey had not begun as a haven for women. Abelard had founded it some years earlier, when he fled the glare of Parisian scandal and sought refuge in scholarship and prayer. But its original purpose had withered as he moved on, searching for safer ground. The Paraclete had become dormant, a name without a mission, until Heloise arrived. After the violent unraveling of their public lives, Abelard made the decision to entrust the abbey to Heloise. It was not a romantic gesture. It was practical, and yet it was intimate in a way only their history could explain. He gave her not flowers or flattery, but leadership, land, responsibility. In an age when women were expected to obey, to fade, to fold into male institutions, he gave her a place where her intellect could take root, a place she could command. She accepted, not with joy, not with resignation, with resolve. And so, in the stillness of a place forgotten by time, Heloise began to build. There is little spectacle in the day-to-day of abbey life. There are no feasts, no grand speeches, but there is meaning. Rising before dawn, kneeling through matins, guiding young women through scripture and letters and silence. The walls of the Paraclete absorbed these rhythms. They were shaped by the labor of women, washing, tending, transcribing, praying. Heloise did more than oversee. She taught and wrote. She governed with a mind sharpened by years of study and a heart tempered by loss. The women who came to the Paraclete were not always saints. Some were noble daughters, set aside from marriage, others, widows. A few, like Heloise herself, were marked by scandal or sorrow. She did not ask their histories. She gave them purpose, and in doing so, she found her own. She would never become what the world wanted her to be. Not Fulbert's innocent niece, not Abelard's obedient bride, not a saint in the mold of pious silence, but she became something rarer, a woman with agency in an age that erased women's names. She corresponded with bishops, with abbots, even with Abelard himself. Their letters from this period form one of the most extraordinary records of medieval thought, a dialogue between equals. She did not flatter him. She questioned him. She reminded him of his contradictions. She remembered not just the scholar, but the man, his weaknesses, his evasions. In one of her most famous letters, she asked him why, when he preached suffering as redemptive, he had never truly acknowledged hers. Why the woman who had lost her name, her body, her future, for love of him, was now asked only to be obedient, grateful. It was not bitterness. It was clarity. She did not seek pity. She sought to be seen. And through all of it, the correspondence, the cloister, the cold dawns, she led. Records from the time note her wisdom, her strength. The Paraclete grew under her watch. New buildings, new sisters. The abbey became a place of learning, where Latin was studied, where ideas were not silenced, but sharpened. She allowed the women in her charge to think, to read, to ask questions. It was radical, quietly so. And yet, beneath the discipline and the governance, there was still mourning, not the dramatic kind, not wailing or weeping, but something deeper, a still ache that never quite left her. She had once loved with a fire that burned through walls and vows and scripture. She had once believed they could remake the world with letters and desire. Now she wore the veil, heard the bell toll before dawn, and read his words by candlelight. There were moments, surely, when the past returned. A line of poetry, a phrase in Latin, the memory of his voice in a lecture hall. But she never allowed herself nostalgia, only clarity. She remembered everything. She did not hide from pain. She built around it, and as the years passed, the Paraclete stood firm. Through political shifts, through storms and seasons, Heloise remained abbess. She outlived many of the men who once judged her. She preserved the letters. She kept the memory, not just of a love, but of a mind, of an era. No one crowned her. No one canonized her. But the women who passed through her gates knew her name. They knew her strength. She became not a relic of a scandal, but the author of her own survival. And the Paraclete? It still stands as a quiet monument to a woman who refused to disappear. Abelard never stopped writing, even after her letters stopped coming. His final works read like someone trying to earn redemption. The later years of Peter Abelard's life were quieter than the fiery decades that came before. Not because his thoughts had dimmed, nor because the church had finally accepted him, but because age and pain and exile had taught him how to hide in plain sight. He lived in monasteries, but he was never quite a monk in spirit. The rule of Saint Benedict demanded silence, humility, obedience. Abelard gave them none of these easily. His nature was restless. He still sought questions no one else dared to ask. And even when he bowed his head in prayer, his mind often drifted back to Paris, to her, to debates he hadn't finished. And so, he wrote. In cold scriptoria and flickering lamplight, he took up his pen and did what he had always done, made arguments, not for audiences, not for approval, but because he couldn't help it. Logic, theology, language, he turned them over like stones in his hands. He was no longer the golden professor of the left bank. His body was broken. His pride had been punished. But his mind had not abandoned him. It had only deepened. One of his final and most ambitious works was Ethica, or Cito te ipsum. Know thyself. It was not written for the church. It was written for the soul. In it, he argued that sin was not simply action. It was intention. That God judged the heart more than the hand. That virtue required understanding, not blind obedience. These were dangerous thoughts in the 12th century. They implied that confession without reflection was empty. That morality lived in reason. Abelard had once tried to reshape the way men thought about philosophy. Now, he tried to reshape the way they thought about guilt. And there was guilt. It pulsed between the lines. He never stopped writing about love, but not in the way poets do. He wrote of its cost, its contradictions. He never used her name in his theological treatises, but she lingered there, in the quiet spaces, in the way he circled themes of loss, of sacrifice, of salvation earned through suffering. He once wrote that the greatest torment of hell was not fire, but separation. He knew something of both. By now, the letters had slowed between them, not out of anger, not from lack of feeling, but perhaps from necessity. She had her abbey, her responsibilities, her dignity. He had his parchment and prayers. It is likely that they never saw each other again. And yet, he kept writing. He composed hymns. He wrote biblical commentaries. His Theologia Scholarium explored the unity and trinity of God, dangerous ground in a time when heresy was defined by nuance. He engaged with Jewish and Muslim ideas, seeking logic even in difference, He refused simple answers. Where others said mystery, he said reason. Some hated him for it. Bernard of Clairvaux, the Church's great moralist, called him arrogant, a heretic, a corrupter of youth. Their conflict came to a head at the Council of Sens in 1141. Abelard was summoned, accused, condemned before he could defend himself. He did not shout. He did not argue. He simply walked away. Some say this was humility. Others say it was exhaustion. He had spent his life in pursuit of truth. He had believed that reason and faith could live together, but the world did not always reward such belief. Even his brilliance could not shield him from the politics of orthodoxy. In the end, it may not have been the Church that defeated Abelard, but time. And still, he wrote, until his hands could barely hold the quill, until his body, already mutilated, already weary, began to fail. He ended his days under the protection of Peter the Venerable, abbot of Cluny. Cluny was not just a monastery. It was a center of diplomacy, art, learning. Abelard found there, at last, a kind of sanctuary. Peter treated him not as a heretic, but as a wounded genius. He offered peace, not penance. It was here that Abelard composed his final letters, quiet ones, grateful ones. He spoke of rest, and when death came, it did not roar. It slipped in quietly. Around the year 1142, Abelard died, no longer a threat to the Church, no longer a scandal, but a man whose words would outlive his body. He was buried, not in Paris, not near the universities where he had once reigned, but at the Abbey of the Paraclete. At her abbey, he did not ask for this, but she made it so. Heloise arranged for his remains to be brought to the Paraclete. She placed him there, not as a lover, not as a husband, but as the other half of a long, unfinished sentence. They had not lived a peaceful love. But perhaps, in this final act, there was peace. She would be buried beside him years later. And long after that, long after the abbey fell into ruins and revolutions swept France, long after the Enlightenment mocked faith and Romanticism praised tragic love, their bones were moved again to Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. A stone tomb, ivy-covered. Tourists still visit it today. Some say they were never truly buried there. Some say their remains are still separate. But the story remains. Peter Abelard, the man who reasoned his way into trouble and then into history, who wrote as if salvation depended on the clarity of thought, who suffered, not silently, but publicly, and turned that suffering into philosophy. And Heloise read every word. It's a quiet corner now, green with ivy, softened by age, nestled among the stones of Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. You'll find it marked by a Gothic canopy, ornate but weathered, with the figures of a man and a woman carved in eternal rest. Peter Abelard and Heloise. Names etched side by side. Lovers, thinkers, victims of their time. But it didn't begin here. Abelard died in 1142, far from the grand avenues of Paris, at the Abbey of Saint-Marcel near Chalon-sur-Saône. His final years had been spent in scholarly retreat under the protection of Peter the Venerable at Cluny. He died not as a condemned man, but as a thinker still feared and still revered. According to Peter, his soul was received with peace. His remains were first interred at Saint-Marcel, in the quiet monastic grounds. And that could have been the end of it. But Heloise had other ideas. She was still alive then, abbess of the Paraclete, the very abbey Abelard had once founded, and she now led with intelligence and resolve. She requested that his remains be moved to the Paraclete, a place of learning, prayer, and memory. She made her case as a woman of rank and reputation, and her request was granted. And so, sometime after 1142, Abelard's body was reburied at the Paraclete. There it stayed. For a time, Heloise would die over 20 years later, around 1163 or 1164. The exact date is lost, but the act that followed is better recorded. She was buried beside him, quietly, without spectacle. In death, they were finally allowed what life denied them: proximity. For centuries, pilgrims came to the Paraclete not to venerate saints, but to remember lovers. And yet, even this was not permanent. History has a way of stirring the earth. During the French Revolution, the Paraclete was dissolved, its sacred grounds seized by the state, its buildings dismantled. The revolutionaries were not fond of clerical institutions, but even they recognized the pull of the story. In the early 19th century, Abelard and Heloise's tomb was exhumed and moved, first to the church of Nogent-sur-Seine, then to a crypt, and finally, in 1817, to Paris itself, to Père Lachaise. This cemetery was new then, designed not only as a burial ground, but as a place of reflection and reverence. The city planners understood something crucial. People would come to see graves if the stories buried there were worth the journey. The tomb of Abelard and Heloise became an anchor, a symbol. Romanticism had swept through Europe, and their tale, equal parts love, tragedy, and intellect, fit perfectly. Their tomb was reassembled like a shrine. Fragments from the original Paraclete Abbey were used. Gothic elements were added. Statues laid side by side, hands nearly touching. Tour guides would whisper the story to visiting poets and lovers. And for 2 centuries, that's where they've remained. But were they really reunited? This question lingers, awkward and unresolved. Records from the Revolutionary period are patchy. It is certain that something was moved: bones, caskets, sarcophagi. But who exactly lies beneath the stone canopy at Père Lachaise? Some historians argue that only Abelard's remains made it to Paris. Others say both bodies were scattered or lost during the chaos. There's even speculation that, by the time of reburial, only symbolic relics, perhaps soil, perhaps an empty coffin, were interred. No forensic study has ever been allowed. To open the tomb would be to challenge the myth. And in some cases, the myth is what matters most. Tourists still pause before the monument. Some leave flowers, some leave notes. A few leave locks of hair or bits of poetry. They peer in through the iron gate, looking at the marble effigies, wondering if the bones of 2 brilliant, broken people truly rest there, together at last. And maybe that's the wrong question, because in many ways, Abelard and Heloise were never just 2 individuals. They became something larger. Their letters were copied and preserved long after their deaths. Their story became the template for tragic love, for forbidden desire tangled with faith and philosophy. Their arguments about gender, learning, power, suffering still resonate. They are read not just as lovers, but as interlocutors across the centuries, Together in stone, together in story. If the tomb is empty, it is still full. Full of memory, full of grief, full of questions no grave can contain. In life, they fought to be heard. In death, they became a symbol. Whether or not they share the same soil, they share something rarer. A place in history, not just as romantic figures, but as intellectual equals. And that is the real reunion. When most remember Heloise, they remember a lover, a woman whose life was shaped by a man's ambition, by a scandal, by a secret. But that's only the surface, only what later poets and novelists chose to preserve. The truth is deeper, more remarkable. Heloise was never just someone's beloved. She was a thinker in her own right, a leader, a scholar, and above all, a woman determined to preserve her voice in a world that rarely allowed women one. She had studied Latin and Greek when few women could read at all. She knew scripture, philosophy, and classical literature. She quoted Cicero with ease and debated theological points with the sharpness of a university master. Even as abbess of the Paraclete, overseeing the lives and souls of dozens of women, she read constantly and wrote when others would have been content to remain silent. Her surviving letters are more than personal confessions. They are intellectual duels, full of moral questioning and philosophical insight. In them, she challenges Abelard's decisions, rejects easy interpretations of love and suffering, and pushes back against the notion that a woman must surrender her mind to faith or to feeling. God knows, she once wrote to Abelard, "I would rather be your whore than his queen." It was not a cry of submission, but a declaration of independence from a world that told her what she was allowed to value. As abbess, she oversaw not just a religious order, but a school. Under her leadership, the Paraclete became a center of learning for women. Heloise believed that women should have access to education not as a luxury, but as a right. She commissioned translations, preserved texts, and ensured that future generations of women, nuns and scholars alike, would have the tools to study and think for themselves. Some modern scholars believe Heloise may have composed the Problemata Heloisae, a series of theological questions addressed to Abelard. These weren't idle musings. They covered topics like divine justice, the nature of sin, and whether intentions or actions matter more in God's judgment. In tone and content, they are the work of someone trained in dialectic, deeply curious, and wholly unafraid to question even the most sacred assumptions. When Abelard's letters stopped, Heloise didn't stop reading. When the church tried to reduce her to a pious footnote, she remained active, engaged, commanding. Even in grief, she governed. Even in silence, she resisted. Her role as abbess was more than clerical. It was intellectual, political, and deeply human. To say she was merely his love is to miss the very thing that drew Abelard to her in the first place. It wasn't her beauty, though she had that. It wasn't her obedience, which she never truly offered. It was her mind. It was her refusal to be anything less than brilliant. That is what lasted. That is why, nearly 1,000 years later, her words still feel alive. Abelard lived in the age of cathedral schools and cloistered scholars. Before there were universities, there were masters, and Abelard was the most notorious of them all. He had risen to fame in Paris, not just because he knew more than others, but because he dared to think differently. He taught logic like a battlefield. His students adored him. His rivals feared him, and the church? It braced itself every time he picked up a pen. Long before his name became a scandal, Abelard had already been shaping the way Europe thought. He introduced the sic et non, yes and no, method, asking seemingly contradictory theological questions and then answering both sides through argument and reason. It wasn't blasphemy, it was innovation. He believed reason and faith could coexist, that logic could sharpen belief rather than weaken it. This was radical in an era where many viewed doubt as sin. His lectures drew crowds. His writings challenged authority. His commentaries on Peter Lombard's sentences would go on to influence theologians for centuries. Even Thomas Aquinas, who disagreed with much of Abelard's work, acknowledged his importance. Abelard was one of the first to suggest that sin lay not in the act itself, but in the intention behind it. This idea, that morality is rooted in will and not just in deed, became foundational to later Christian ethics. But his genius didn't protect him. It made him a target. The church condemned some of his writings. His enemies accused him of heresy, pride, arrogance. Yet even after exile, castration, and ruin, he kept writing, kept thinking. His mind remained his weapon and his sanctuary. He didn't just invent new ways of reasoning. He helped invent the very idea of university learning. Before Abelard, students followed teachers. After Abelard, they sought out ideas. He helped transform education from rote memorization into dialectic exchange, from sacred repetition into intellectual challenge. Without him, the university as we know it might never have taken form. And still, for all his achievements, Abelard died believing he had failed. He felt he had failed Heloise, failed his students, failed God. In his final years, his letters are marked by a sorrow so deep it reads like penance. He looked at his life's work not as triumph, but as something unfinished, something broken. But history would remember differently. In the centuries after his death, his writings were preserved, studied, debated. His name, once whispered with scandal, came to stand for something more, for courage, for curiosity, for the belief that no question is too dangerous, no mind too sharp for truth. Even his enemies, Bernard of Clairvaux among them, could not fully silence him. His words survived inquisitions, wars, and centuries of dust. And today, in the libraries of Paris and Oxford, in the reading rooms of theology students, and the minds of those who still wrestle with faith, Abelard's thoughts live on. He may have died thinking he failed. But failure, like love, is not always the final word. Now, what do you call a tale where two brilliant minds find each other, burn brightly, then spend the rest of their lives apart, writing across miles and decades, circling the memory of something that was never allowed to last? A romance? A tragedy? Something in between? Abelard and Heloise were not Romeo and Juliet. They didn't die in each other's arms, nor were they separated by some tidy stroke of fate. Their story was messier, more adult, more real. It was filled with intellect, ambition, injury, both emotional and physical, and a kind of devotion that outlived passion, but never truly found peace. If it were only a love story, perhaps it would have ended at the wedding, or with the birth of their son, or even with a reconciliation. But it didn't. It ended with letters. Even in those letters, they never agreed on what they had. Abelard, broken and full of guilt, framed their relationship as sin, a mistake he'd paid for in blood. Heloise never accepted that version. She remembered joy, not transgression. She remembered a love that was worth the risk, and when he begged her to forget him, to live as a bride of Christ, she refused. Not out of defiance, but because forgetting would have meant lying to herself. For Heloise, love and intellect were never separate. She didn't want domesticity or protection. She wanted dialogue. She wanted to be seen and heard as an equal. And that, perhaps, is where the true tragedy lies. Because even as Abelard revered her mind, even as he answered her questions with philosophical precision, he never gave her the closure she wanted. His love was measured, distant, tinged with shame. Hers was relentless, stubborn, alive. And the world around them? It punished both, not just for desire, but for being too loud, too smart, too unwilling to bend. Fulbert's revenge, the church's censure, the monastery's silence, all were mechanisms of a system built to tame minds like theirs. Theirs was not a failure of love, but a failure of the world to make space for it. When Abelard was attacked, it wasn't just his body that was harmed. It was a warning to scholars who dared think too freely, to women who dared choose love over obedience. And Heloise's forced entry into the convent wasn't just about scandal. It was about control, about erasing a woman who had spoken too clearly, too boldly. Yet they endured. Heloise became an abbess, a teacher, a keeper of knowledge. Abelard continued to write, to question, to shape theological thought. They built legacies from the ruins, but they never built a life together. So was it a love story? Perhaps, but not one of happy endings, not one you tell to children before bed. It was a love story written in the margins of books, in the folds of parchment, between lines of Latin. A love that argued with itself, longed for something it couldn't name, and kept going even when both hearts had resigned. Or was it a tragedy? A cautionary tale about brilliance colliding with tradition, about how even the deepest passion can be drowned by guilt and fear? A warning about what happens when institutions, not just religious, but cultural, refuse to let people define their own lives? Maybe it's both. Maybe that's why we still read them. Not because they were perfect lovers, but because they were imperfect people who dared to love, to think, and to defy, even when everything told them not to. And maybe the final tragedy is this: they never saw each other again. Not after the attack, not after the convent, not after the letters. Their final reunion was posthumous, under a shared stone in a cemetery, far removed from the cloisters and cloaks of their youth. And even that stone has been moved, debated, doubted. Are they really buried together? Or are we simply trying to give their story the ending it never had? It's tempting to rewrite the ending, to imagine an aged Abelard returning to the Paraclete, and Heloise meeting him in the garden. No words, just the shared silence of two lives that never truly untangled. But history doesn't allow for that kind of closure. All it offers is what they left behind: pages of thought, pages of feeling, preserved not because they were romantic, but because they were honest. So now, it's yours to decide. Was this a love story, wrecked by the world around it? Or a tragedy, made inevitable by the very hearts that lived it? Either way, Abelard and Heloise remain. In books, in letters, in questions that still haven't been answered. And sometimes that's enough. The covers are warm around your shoulders. Maybe there's a faint hum, an old heater, a distant car, a soft whir of wind beyond your window. The lights are dim, or maybe off entirely, just the glow of your screen, or the echo of a voice reading history out loud. The world is quiet now, but not silent, because somewhere, not far from the bustle of modern Paris, under the crooked shade of trees in Père Lachaise cemetery, two names still whisper to each other across time: Abelard et Heloise. Their tomb is a strange kind of monument, stone, solemn, half Gothic, half imagined. People leave flowers there, letters, notes with trembling handwriting. Lovers touch the railings. Tourists read the plaques. And scholars, well, scholars still argue about whether it's really them beneath the stone at all. But that hardly matters now, because stories, once they root themselves, outgrow the need for proof. You're lying here tonight, not because you're preparing for an exam or chasing a footnote, but because their voices still reach us. Across centuries of ash and parchment, you followed them through candlelit corridors, cold convents, blood-stained revenge, and quiet, ink-streaked regret. And now, you're here. Not in a cloister, not in a library, but wrapped in sheets, thousands of years from parchment and pain. But they're still with you. You see, there's a strange kind of eternity in being remembered. Not the gold-plated one carved into cathedral ceilings, but the fragile kind that flickers alive when someone says your name with wonder. Abelard, Heloise. You've said them now, or at least thought them. That counts. And when we remember them, we don't just recall dates or drama. We remember what they stood for, however imperfectly. The fight to think freely, to love outside rules, to challenge the world, even if the world breaks you for it. They didn't win? Not really. The church carried on. The universities buried their writings for a while, and the convent walls didn't crumble the day Heloise walked through them. But still, they left marks. Marks you can trace. In the way scholars debate morality now, in the way letters are written, in the way we question systems that ask us to deny love, ambition, or self. And maybe the most remarkable thing, we don't remember them for being saints. We remember them because they were so very human. They wanted too much, said the wrong things, regretted, relented, rewrote, but they kept speaking. Their letters didn't promise forever. They didn't end in reunion or closure. They ended the way real life often does, unresolved. But the beauty is that they ended at all, with words on paper, with memories they insisted on preserving, even when it hurt. And now, here you are, breathing quietly in the dark, somewhere far from 12th century Paris. And yet, not far at all. Maybe tomorrow you'll forget the dates, the abbey names, the theological disputes, but you'll remember something else, a feeling, that ache of wanting and not having, that fire of a mind refusing to be silenced, that long thread of connection, strange, warm, human, that stretches between their world and yours. Because history isn't gone, it's just sleeping. And tonight, as your eyes grow heavier, you're part of that dream. You're not in danger here, not hunted by Fulber, not forced behind monastery walls, but still, you carry echoes of the same questions. What do we owe to love? To ourselves? To the truth? They asked. We still ask. maybe that's the only kind of immortality that matters. So sleep now, and when you wake, Abelard and Heloise will still be waiting, in libraries, in footnotes, in love letters, written by people who've never heard their names but feel the same storms. History sleeps, yes, but it never forgets. Thanks for listening. If you're already asleep, great. We've successfully lulled you to sleep. And if you're still awake, well, that's impressive. If you genuinely enjoy these boring stories about history, feel free to subscribe to our channel whenever you're in the mood. Sleep well, and good night.